Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. Today on the podcast, I am thrilled to welcome somebody that I have admired for quite a while, Johann Kurtz. Johann, welcome to Radical Personal Finance.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about your new book called Leaving a Legacy. What's the subtitle? Inheritance, Charity, and 1,000-Year Families. And I love that subtitle as I myself am hoping to build a 1,000-year family. And I have I've long admired some of the families who have done this. However, longtime Radical Personal Finance listeners, this will not be the first time they've been introduced to your work. In episode 1025 from June of 2024, I read your essay called "The Rich Should Leave Their Wealth to Their Children, Not to Charity" on the podcast, and had good feedback to that. And I want to thank you for writing that essay. It's been inspiring to me, and I think it cuts right at the heart of what we're going to talk about today. So I'd like to begin, though. You seem to have a deep passion for this topic of leaving a legacy, and you in your writing systematically undo some of the assumptions that I have made about just how the world should be. So I'd like to begin. Tell us a little bit about your background and why some of these topics are so important to you.
Sure. Well, if I had to frame it in terms of my background, it's sort of, of course, a mixture of things I've come across over the years and has become more urgent to me thanks to more recent trends I've observed. But in terms of my background, I went to a school that is considered one of the better schools in London, in Britain, and probably one of the better schools in the country. And frankly, that was a slightly disappointing experience in that this is a part of the world that is heavily romanticized. These very old English schools, my school is 600 years old, something like that. And you would expect it to be this almost sort of mythical experience with old stones and ancient wisdom being passed down and beautiful old things being revered, but it was very far from that. And you had this very dignified institution that was populated by people who I felt were getting a very technocratic education, a sort of disappointingly narrow education, highly focused on the exams necessary to get into very particular programs, primarily at Oxford and Cambridge, but elsewhere. And this institution was turning out fundamentally quite uninteresting young people, which I thought was a great shame. And I don't see myself as any better than them. I indeed went on to work in tech for a long time, so I'm no better than the rest of them there. But I do, reflecting on that, it did seem sad to me that a small, wonderful, ancient corner of the world had sort of fallen to this machine that has swept up the rest of the world as well. And it was not just a sort of aesthetic, perhaps slightly quaint dimension that was lacking. Also, there was this tremendous, I would phrase it as a metaphysical or spiritual loss, in that, again, you had this incredibly talented pool of young people going through a very expensive education, the scions of successful families and so forth. But we had several people in that year institutionalized from drug abuse, which is kind of crazy given the investment that was being made on making sure that these children were being raised to be as effective as possible. And it all seemed a bit directionless. It all seemed like it had fallen apart and lost confidence in itself. And so I think that's kind of the background I'm coming from. I came out of that and became very interested in the parts of my family history that I'd sort of lost contact with, and that included the sort of spiritual history of my family, which is an interesting one. We're English Catholics, which is a relative minority. But I'd say that's the background milieu that I emerged out of.
It feels to me, when I read your work, it feels to me, I resonate with it, and I've resonated so much with this book because it just seems to me like we're living in a day and age in which we come from an inheritance that we recognize as great, and yet the current expression of that is not. And so it feels to me like we've lived on the last vestiges of the wealth, the cultural wealth, for a long time. And now that's running out, but we're not sure how to go back and find those systems that have put it back together. And so it seems to me, do we share that common sensation, you and I?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's a real paradox you see online in the somewhat political spaces that I inhabit, whereby you see very wealthy conservatives, both in my country and in America, my country being Britain, and they revere our nation's history in a way. They are very quick to tie themselves into the great men of English and American history, narratively, and of course, the founding fathers get a certain reverence. But if you look at the actual towns they build, the homes they build, although often they will post great architecture from history as a kind of thing that they're proud of, that they associate with their country's greatness, they seem to really struggle in actually building anything like that themselves. And my contention is that there is some living element intergenerationally which has been severed, that actually you need to feel not just notionally attracted and that such things have value, but you actually need to be part of a living tradition of people, families who build like that, who have the confidence to build like that, who have the connections and the taste and the instinct to actually do that. It's kind of the difference between talking about action and living action, which, as any entrepreneur knows, that's sort of a boundary that is intimidating at first, that you have to cross to get to the next level. So yeah, there does seem to be some very fundamental discordance here that we need to get through.
All right. I'd like to begin. So you have, as I said in the intro, you've challenged me on things that I considered to be true and just absorbed without question. I'd like to begin with the concepts of nepotism and meritocracy. Growing up as an American, I have always absorbed as obviously true that we should live in a meritocracy, which means that the person with the greatest merit should always be given the opportunity, and that any kind of preferential treatment for one's own kin, one's own people, one's own anything, neighbors, is wrong, and that this expands basically to a global basis. And yet you have persuaded me that that might not necessarily be so. Share with us about this topic and your view on it.
Sure. Well, let me start with a few framing observations. The first is that there's a narrative that what makes our society in particular, the modern West, so excellent at science and everything else is that we are unique in our embrace of a class agnostic meritocracy. The best companies do this. They interview everyone fairly. The best orchestras won't even look at who is playing the music so that they get the most objective picture possible. One of the things I contend in the book is that it is not in fact true that this philosophy, this motivating philosophy, is unique to our society. In fact, essentially every epoch in Western history has, as a matter of justice, as a matter of self-evident truth, contended that the most excellent people should lead. And this goes all the way back to ancient Greeks, who had this ideal of arete, which is a sort of variation of excellence, a sort of metaphysical excellence. And that persists. The question which changes is not should or should not the best amongst us lead. That is usually taken as self-evident. The question is what qualifies as the best. And my belief is that actually something has changed in the very recent history of the West. It is also not true to say that meritocracy as we now understand it built the West, because modern meritocracy doesn't apply, for example, if you even go back 100 years in American history to when America was already well on the way to being the most powerful, prosperous, and populous European nation in history, or really in the history of the world. America, at the turn of the 20th century, for example, was still 90% of people worked in agriculture. Most of those agricultural units were owned by the people who worked them or were employees of family farms. And then going on, many of the most successful firms of the 20th century were these family firms. They were multi-generational family firms. And to this day, the literature shows, and I quote John A. Davis, who's a former professor at Harvard Business School and MIT, Sloan School of Management, that actually family firms in the market outcompete publicly traded firms who, switch management every few years and so forth. Now, the question is like, what is going on there, and what else is confounding us? And basically, my contention is that our definition of merit has actually become radically impoverished in that it has been captured by a system which people are often quick to lament because they recognize that it suppresses excellence, which is a system of mass standardized testing, mass, procedures of entry into the mainstream career paths and so forth in a way that really reduces the aperture of excellence that we are actually testing. And that this is actually very destructive in many ways. It's destructive to I think there's a well-trodden path that this kind of rich meritocratic pipeline is destructive to individual excellence when it really formalizes mass standardized testing. But the main argument in the book is that it's actually a tremendous cultural loss when you start refusing to recognize, as modern meritocracy does, the actual importance of the continuation of particular families, in particular industries, in particular localities, that these things are actually constitutive of a rich social fabric which underpins traditions, which underpins a sense of place, of history, of community unity, that actually you start damaging the very deep structures of society when you start insisting on this very pure version of meritocracy as a kind of agnostic test of two people against each other on very, very limited domains. And indeed, I think there's been some popular outrage at that line recently. Vivek Ramaswamy had one of the most viral posts on Twitter ever around Christmas time of last year, when he said, look, the problems with America is that they're not willing to compete in a meritocratic international marketplace. And if they're not able to shape up along these narrow exam lines, for example, these studious lines, then they deserve essentially to be replaced by people from other nations who are. The problem is, and I'll finish here, that philosophy very quickly devolves into a kind of South Korea style dysfunctional society in which people become completely consumed by perfecting their children along artificially narrow lines to the detriment of their birth rate, the cohesion of their society, the relationships amongst their young and between the genders. Like, it becomes this very pathological thing. So it is very important to ensure that the best people are in the best roles in society. But my plea is that we evaluate that in a more holistic way that actually considers things like identity, history, tradition, family, faith, relationships. And I sort of lay out a framework for doing that in the book.
Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful one. What it strikes to me is we have a mutual friend, Greg Treat. I've been doing a series of interviews with him on the podcast. And he has this concept that he teaches called games of life versus games of death. And when he first started talking, or life games and death games, I guess is how he phrased it. When he first started using this terminology, I did not understand it at all. And it's taken me a while. But now I basically see the world given that framework that he developed. And as he defines those terms, a death game is one where failure means you might have an inability to meet your covenantal obligations. That's what he would say. I would simplify it and just say a death game is one in which the consequences for failure are enormous. If you are not if you're working at a job and you mess something up and you demonstrate that you're not the person who's done the best job, you lose your job, you lose your home, you lose your wife. If you are engaged in something where if you make a mistake, everything is at stake. And what happens with death games, which is what most people are playing, is that we are living in a constant state of tension and stress, knowing that one minor misstep can mess everything up. And in societies where this is taken to the extreme, I would say, like perhaps South Korea or other Asian societies, one bad test performance is the defining feature of your life. Meanwhile, a game of life is one in which, how does Greg put it? You play for honor and for status, not for life or death. And so this is where if my child messes up or if my child does poorly on something, I don't risk that person with being excommunicated from the family. Rather, I just say, hey, we can do better next time. And we're aiming for the trophy. And you have a friendlier, warmer environment where you know you're not alone. And as I've reflected on this seems to be, we see the downstream effects of this in a lot of our social dysfunction. Most of us, perhaps in times past, have felt like we were part of a family, and that family may have been our own blood relations. If it were not our blood relations, then we felt like we were part of a tribe. We felt like we were part of a people. It could be a town, it could be a community, it could be a parish, any number of organizational expressions. And so we know that we're on a team and that other people have our back and we're competing for honor and for status within the team, but we're not truly alone. Whereas in the modern age, it feels like those structures have largely disappeared. And now we fight with one another as to what a national government should provide for us to try to regain some of that sense of cohesion. And yet we continue to be brutally lonely and to feel like any minor mistake is going to mess us up. And we're looking around, especially the younger generation, we're looking around saying, isn't there someone who's going to be on my team? And if there's not, I'm going to have to create someone, and I'm going to have to create a new team, and I'm going to have to press forward. And sometimes that's healthy, and sometimes it's not. And what I observed is that you touch your finger on the original version of the team. I want to read a quote from what you said here in one of the opening chapters. You wrote one of the most astounding paragraphs, excuse me. Do you resonate with kind of that perspective that I shared?
Absolutely, yeah. I think one of the problems is that meritocracy is very keen on comparing things like test scores or interview performances or physical standards, these kind of things. And there's actually a whole subtle dimension of human existence which depends on things which are more ineffable. To give a few examples really quickly before you read this paragraph, people who've gone to college and who have joined fraternities actually out-earn those who don't, even though they end up typically with slightly lower grades. And that is because there is this whole dimension of human society which is about relationships. These people also incidentally tend to give more back to their college afterwards because they feel a particular human connection to the institution. The same is true of athletes. The same is true of legacy admits. So there's this whole human ecology under the surface, which is more difficult to capture in these formalized tests, but is nonetheless integral to the functioning of the institution. Another example is I have friends who went to, some of the best universities in the world, and I've had people lament to me recently that these places are now entirely without a sense of place, in that often these student bodies are now so international and so diverse, and there's nothing wrong with that on the surface. No one that's joining these institutions are bad people, but they don't celebrate any of the traditional holidays, for example, or the traditions of the legacy admits. They don't dress like the legacy admits. And a whole sense of culture and place and history and tradition has been lost. And that is actually important. That's important to our sense of loyalty to an institution. That's important to our sense of ourselves as someone who is bound into, after we're a graduate of a particular institution, the community of other people who have been to that institution, to our integration into our nation's history. And the same is true of a family farm, for instance. It is actually something important is retained when a father passes his farm to his son, which is a certain continuity of obligation, of place, of story, of history that is integral to the fabric of the nation. And when you undermine this, what you actually find is an epidemic of children who feel disenfranchised. You find an epidemic of cheating because they want to game what they see as an overly narrow system. And you basically lose everything which makes us nostalgic for the West. It's something very rich that we're losing.
Yeah. I'll read these from one of the early chapters of your book. You talk about King Edward and his abdication from the throne, and then you say this: there is a cruel stereotype about the post-war generation, and yet it is one that is not entirely without truth. It is the source of much discord between the generations, and it is one that we must resolve if we are to move forwards in love and strength. This stereotype is exemplified in the philosophy of high net worth individuals like singer Marie Osmond, who declared, I just think all an inheritance does is breed laziness and entitlement. I worked hard and I'm going to spend it all and have fun with my husband. The younger generations, meanwhile, are struggling to buy homes, find rewarding work in globalized labor pools, and start families. And yet many of them see their elders in possession of large houses and leading hedonistic lifestyles which feature an abundance of trivialities like golf and cruises. The young believe that the old have abandoned their duty to posterity. That violation of duty is, I believe, one of the most underemphasized things in our society. And that when I look at my forebears, a big part of our current position is that violation of duty. So, if true, what do you see is the duty of the older to the younger?
Well, it is. Let me start by saying that although I think this violation of duty is real, I also think it's more understandable that it has occurred than many people who react with pure outrage. And the reason for this is that all of the traditional underpinnings of our economy, of the trajectories of families and class dynamics has all been through a revolution in the last 150 years or so, certainly since the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of the things that were the natural foundations of intergenerational stability and an understanding of obligation have been eroded, and they need to kind of be intentionally replaced. So in a world where agrarian economics dominates and you have family farms constituting the majority of the nation's economy, it is uncontroversial to say that a father should give his farm to his son. There is no suggestion that the farm should be sold, given off to charity, and that the son should just have to fend for himself in a position of like incredible vulnerability. The reason for this is that no one is under the impression that being given a farm is going to corrupt a child. In that, a farm demands labor. It's actually a very hard living that must be earned. So you're giving your son a gift, but one that also empowers him to work hard and gain a sense of virtue. I think a lot of people are lost in the modern world as to how to do that second part. They have a lot in terms of wealth. They've achieved a lot in terms of social mobility, what they've earned, what they've gained, but they're not really sure how to pass those things on to their children without corrupting, without undermining the very thing which served them well, which was the work ethic, which gave them those things in the first place. So I am sympathetic to people who say, I'm tempted to disinherit my child because I can't see how to give them all I have without removing their incentive to work. But I don't think that answer is quite good enough. I think we need to try harder. I mean, I think what I say in the book is if you're concerned that your child is going to be given something and will shy away from an appetite for greatness, nonetheless, for the very best things in life, then it is hypocritical to not attempt the same thing. I mean, you are now in control of these tremendous resources, and you must strive to the very best things in life. And really what built the most beautiful things in the West, the most lasting things, the most magnificent things are these intergenerational projects, which represent a continuity of values and virtues across generations, usually within particular families and communities. So I think, yes, the older generation are, for the most part, well, actually, I don't want to mischaracterize an entire generation. I think that a lot of people have legitimate grievances against their parents when their parents are engaging in what I see as irresponsible behavior, which is particularly a kind of hedonism post-retirement, which spends down a significant portion of the family wealth. Of course, this is not true of everyone, but to those whom it does apply, it is a problem. And there is this subsection primarily in the ultra high net worth category, although you see it appearing elsewhere, wherein people actively disinherit their children. They give everything to charity, which is mistaken for reasons I go into in the book. But the thing is that yes, I do think a dereliction of duty has taken place. But I don't think the answer is just to insist on this word duty, 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 because I do like to assume positive motivations for people. And I do think that this complex confusion that has been generated by recent societal upheaval is contributing to the sense of intergenerational tension. And I try to sort of structure a response to that.
I've gone through a big change in my philosophy in the last decade with regard to a sense of uh, libertarian freedom that one has in life as compared to basically doing what one is told. When I was younger, I thought that the pathway to fulfillment and happiness was total freedom of choice. And I shaped virtually all of my decisions in that direction to achieve for myself a sense of almost ultimate freedom. And especially with regard to the things that I could do, I created a world where I can come and go as I like. No one tells me what to do with my time. No one tells me what to do with my days. I was very intentional about creating a world in which I could live anywhere in the world that I wanted. And basically, am the master of my fate, where I can do whatever I want. And then I thought, well, when I get to this perspective, I'm going to achieve ultimate happiness because then I can do whatever I want. And I started looking around the world and I realized that this level of freedom, I don't think man is designed for this level of freedom. I found and I find that it is absolutely overwhelming because you face these decisions of where should I live? What should I do? And it's one thing to say, well, should I live in Jonesville or Smithville and they're 30 miles apart or 2 states apart? On the other hand, I've faced my life and I say, should I live in the United States or should I live in Iraq? Should I live in Mexico City or should I live in Ho Chi Minh City? And I can make arguments, endless arguments for the pros and cons of all of them. And you wind up in a situation in where you are constantly having to not only decide the outcome, but you have to come up with the rubric for choice as well as all of the options. And when you have too many options, it is not fun. And what I've experienced in my life is we have the same problem with the paradox of choice that I recently moved back to the United States. When I go to the United States and I go to a supermarket and I try to choose what I'm going to buy, it's overwhelming to have 50 different types of toothpaste to choose from. And so my favorite store that I go to is Costco. And the reason I go to Costco is they give me one choice. And all I have to decide is, do I want toothpaste or not? And maybe 2 or 3 choices. But someone else who is thoughtful and informed, the Costco buyers, they've gone to the marketplace. They've said, what are the basic good products that are out there? And they've decided this is the product that has the best choice of options. And they've given that to me. Now, coming back to goal setting, I used to take this perspective and tell people, well, you should just do whatever you want. But I observe in our culture, especially mine, the American culture, that young people are overwhelmed by having to decide everything. And this applies not only to what I described of where do you go, where do you live, what do you do for work, but even just in terms of what religion do you follow, what are the rules. If I have to sit down with marriage, for example, in days of old, the expectation was you're going to marry and we need to choose a nice girl for you to marry. And a nice girl is defined as this, so go find a nice girl. And a man goes out and he's choosing among 3 to 10 options. And he's trying to find a nice girl that he can marry. Today, I have to decide, well, do I want to marry? What is the meaning of marriage? Should anybody marry? Okay, if I want to marry, do I marry a girl? Do I marry a boy? What is the impact of that? Do I sign a marriage? Like, there's just so much, and it leads to inactivity. So bringing that back to wealth, what I'm inspired by is that I wish I had not grown up with so much libertarian freedom. I wish I had been handed more of a familial sense of identity. This is who our family is. This is what we do. And not total constrictor, not parents saying you must pursue on this pathway because that's that's the ditch on the other side of the road. But there's just this, but having expectations built upon you, I think is a gift that parents can give to their children. And it leads to the flourishing of societies because young people don't have to waste, as I have, a decade or 2 of their lives figuring out what their purpose is. They can just broadly settle into the purpose of their family.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is, of course, a very deep issue, so difficult to surmise an answer in short. But I do think that there are basic aspects of human existence, very foundational concepts, which can only be constituted in situations of mutual obligation. That human communities, on some sense, are defined by their expectations and their boundaries, and yet all of us need to be in very deep human communities. And often the deepest human communities are ones in which the constituent members recognize that they have mutually made tremendous sacrifices for each other, and they'd make them again because of these bonds of love. I think freedom is an incredibly important concept, but I would view that as something like freedom from tyranny, which is unjust imposition on me by other parties who are arbitrarily utilizing their power to impose sinful or disordered obligations upon me. Like, that is, of course, wrong. And we see plenty of that today. So I totally sympathize with the libertarian instinct. And in many ways, I think that's a healthy instinct. I do think a taste for autonomy, self-reliance, drive, agency, these are wonderful aspects and very deep-rooted aspects of the Western and particularly the Anglo tradition. I mean, you can see even in the 14th century the kind of seeds of English individualism. Alan McFarlane has a very good book on this. But I don't think that means that we should, exactly as you say, be required to reason from very first principles about every aspect of our lives, because it's exhausting. And there is no guarantee that we will end up making decisions or even deploying decision-making frameworks that are in any way intelligible to the people closest to us. Like, I want my mother, I want my father to be proud of who I've married. I want them to understand why I married them, what I see in them, how they hope that we will form a family together, and what the legacy we are likely to leave together is, and what that is going to mean to my parents, and how that continues the legacy that their parents left to them. Like, I want the actual vessel of my family to be a concept which contains meaning, which contains definitions and values and structure, because it's only when that's the case that it's something that I can associate with, that I can identify, that I can be proud with. And frankly, all the better if that involves sacrifices, because it's mutual sacrifices to the people you love, which is the sort of certainly the foundational aspect of the Christian experience. But I think, of the human experience more generally, this sense of every narrative, every great hero's tale involves this sacrifice for others, that there is a certain set of moral expectations in the world which are mutually recognized, and the great man rises to that bar. And when you rob people of that, you think you're giving them freedom, but what you're actually communicating is apathy and relativism. Like, it doesn't really matter what you do because it's all the same to me. That isn't an empowering message. In fact, it's a very depressing message.
I want to move in just a moment to kind of the here's what we do rather than just critiques. But the critiques are useful. And you wrote a chapter that, for me, I'm a financial planner, and so I've spent a lot of time in these kinds of conversations, is so fundamental. And it's chapter 4. It says, disinheriting your children won't save them. And I'm going to read 3 excerpts here. He says, where you say, one cannot outsource parenting and the cultivation of virtue to the job market. What these parents, referring to parents in an earlier paragraph, you say some boast of it, like Shaquille O'Neal, right? Of I won't give my children anything. Shaq says, my kids are older now. They're kind of upset with me. I tell them all the time, we ain't rich. I'm rich, and I'm not giving you nothing. And Nigella Lawson, I'm determined that my children should have no financial security. And you say, this is a tragedy. So one cannot outsource parenting and the cultivation of virtue to the job market. What these parents who disinherit their children are doing, whether they realize it or not, is resetting their children to an average position, because this is easier than discovering how to make proper use of an exceptional one. Instead of pursuing new heights, they call a convenient but premature retreat. This provides wealthy parents with the comfort that they will not have to expend radical effort and imagination in their children's spiritual formation. Parents enjoy their riches, but will discard them at the first sign that they come with an obligation. Ironically, this is unambitious and misguided, exactly what they're trying to prevent in their children. This, again, and I know you're British, so you're going to be much more polite than I'm going to be, but to me, this is the core of the reality, and it has to do with how we think about privilege in the modern era. It seems to me that as we use the word privilege, we have tended to adopt the ethic that the goal of you with your privilege is to get rid of it. So therefore, when you are a privileged person, you should discard that privilege. And I believe that this is absolutely immoral. The appropriate thing to do with privilege is to use it where it is needed to raise up and support others who are not. And the example I like to give is I have height privilege. I'm 6.5 feet tall. And I'm rather strong. When I go onto an airplane, it is much easier for me to lift the carry-on suitcases into the overhead bin than it is for the 4-foot-nothing, 70-year-old Chinese woman to do it. But I don't walk onto the airplane and have her follow me and say to her, well, tell you what we'll both do is we'll both just take our suitcases and stuff them under the seat in front of us. Rather, my job is to reach out, to take her suitcase and put it into the overhead bin, because that's what 6.5-foot tall men owe as their duty to 4-foot-nothing Chinese ladies who are 70 years old. And that's the same thing with wealth, is that it comes with a duty, and that the goal is not to get rid of it, but to impart to your children duty. And so I want, I can't speak for you, but to me, this is so fundamental. And the rich have lost that sense of duty and somehow replaced it with the idea, well, if I just get rid of it, if I just chop my legs off because I'm 6.5 feet tall, then everything's going to get better. But you don't, and you destroy your children.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I mean, at the most basic level, we recognize this within the family. So it is accepted that even if you are, let's say, a socialist or a communist, a father requires certain resources to feed his children, right? That is an accepted reality. If there are more people in the family, more mouths to feed, more resources are required. And the adult who is responsible, who has the faculties necessary to manage that distribution within that household, it accrues to him, right, or to them if it's adults. Now, I'm not a socialist and not a communist, so I don't stop there. And one of the things that I think is sadly missing from contemporary social ethics, a sort of vision of the social world, which is much older, and in fact I reference in the book this concept of pietas, is that we now wall the family off as a discrete institution. And I think it's actually a very marginalized institution. I thought what Gregory was saying last time he was on your podcast about how we don't actually give any tax advantages to the expenses of the family, which are absolutely essential, right? Raising the next generation, but we will to corporations is kind of an insane imbalance. But going back one step further, this patriarchy, as it were, really extends outwards into society as a whole. Those parties who are responsibility for the well-being of greater numbers of people do actually require greater resources to do that, especially where those people have particular competences which are exceptional. Naturally, there are always going to be people in society who can't take care of themselves, and yet someone needs to manage the resources that are necessary for the flourishing of society. So it accrues in this hierarchical fashion to different patriarchs, as it were, to manage their domains responsibly. Now, of course, they can abuse that, and that's tyranny, but it is a well-ordered society is one in which there are these responsible individuals who couple their privilege, their faculties, and their duties together to form this reifying order for the families around them in their community. I had something else to say. I've forgotten it. I'll come back to it if I remember it.
So now let's pivot to 1,000-year families. And I've long been an admirer of some enduring families. I've long been an admirer of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, and him kind of being the founding patriarch of this dynasty. Doesn't seem to be as successful as it could have been to me, but it could be. I've admired some of the other dynasties I know about. What are some examples that inspire you of families who have taken their role seriously and who have exercised their duties with excellence?
Yeah, great question. I give examples in the book. I think the one that's the kind of go-to, because it's still living to this day in a very visible way, and it stretches back almost 1,000 years, is the Grosvenor family of Britain. This is the Duke of Westminster's family. And if you look at, to give one manifestation of the importance of the role of these societies in a nation, these families are what Edmund Burke, the sort of father of conservatism, called the ballast in the vessel of the Commonwealth. That is, by the very existence of families thinking and operating according to the logic of ultra long time horizons, naturally society can congregate round them, as it were, and that level of stability and stewardship. Eaton Hall, which is the country home the traditional country home of the Grosvenors, has been through various iterations over the years. All but the one which was built in the 60s are magnificent, and indeed represent really a whole class of homes that is part of what gives Britain its very identity, what makes Britain great. When people think of England, when I think of England, I have never lived in a luxurious country estate. I was born and raised in London. My house was a modest middle class one, but part of my identity as an Englishman, part of the myth I tell myself, part of the stories, the body of law and aesthetics and a vision of the man I am and the place I have and a people attaches to the fact that those beautiful homes exist. And in some sense, they reflect the dignity and vision of my identity as an Englishman. This extends to everything from Pride and Prejudice, which I love, to paintings, to the images I like online and have saved. And, these aesthetics, they define the identity of a nation. And people visit the UK to visit these homes. I visited them myself. I'm going to Windsor Castle when I return to England for Christmas this year. We have the tickets booked. We're going to show it to my children. I'm hoping that will make my children proud and reify their sense of self as Englishmen and, well, English boys and girls. So this role of families in creating these things, cynics view it as they are indulging themselves. But the truth is that all of us benefit when those at the head of society take it upon themselves to build truly great, magnificent, lasting, higher things. An example I've given before is the royal wedding. A cynic would say that is a tremendous display of opulence and waste. This is the wedding of two people. None of them are particularly virtuous. They're just getting married. They're throwing a huge party to celebrate themselves. It's an act of propaganda and self-indulgence. I would say, actually, it is an event that I have observed has united people from members of the underclass, the working class, the middle class, and the upper classes in a shared celebration of identity and belonging and aesthetic vision. It has given every one of those people inspiration as to how to aesthetically comport and curate the events of their own lives, like their children's weddings. It has connected them with the beautiful traditional music that is played at such events that they otherwise would not have listened to. It is this centering of the culture and identity of a people around a great family that actually holds us all together. Now, that is not to say that, the wealthiest families have a monopoly on culture. They certainly don't. Every constituent part of a society does have an element of integral culture. The British working class has an extremely strong aesthetic, musical, sporting culture, and it's integral to our identity as a nation as well. But you lose something incredibly important and uplifting and elevated and refined when you don't have a stable upper class playing that role.
Would one kind of version of that I've thought about, because I myself I've changed, I've matured. When I was younger, I would poke my finger. I remember specifically saying, I recall being a Protestant. I recall, touring great and magnificent cathedrals and saying, what a disgusting waste of money. Couldn't the church have been simpler and the church building very modest and the money been given to the poor? I have criticized those who spend money with abandon. And as I get older, I realize that was really dumb of me, because those who have wealth have a duty to spend it. And almost all expenditures of wealth, at least it keeps the money flowing. And I caught myself that just literally this last week, took my children to a Christmas market, and there was at the Christmas market, it was the child's craft displays, where there were extra children there displaying in addition to the normal vendors. And we went, and I gave them all a certain amount of money, and I sent them out. And as we went through the market, they spent the money that I gave them. And then there were some children that I thought were doing an especially good job, and I took more money and I gave it to my children and said, go and buy from this child vendor. And in the car on the way home, I was talking to them. I was saying, why do you think I did that? And the reality is, I'm a bit of a minimalist. I don't particularly actually want to have any of the crafts or the things that they made, nor do I want my children to have them, just because they kind of clutter up my life. But I said, we are those who have much, and God expects us to be faithful with what he has given to us. And one of the impacts of that is that he expects us to patronize those who are creating things of value. And so I don't get to go to a Christmas market and just walk through with my hands in my pocket and say, I'm just going to enjoy this and I'm going to keep my money in my pocket so I can just grow a little bit richer. No, I am a rich man. And so therefore my obligation is to go to the Christmas market and make certain that those who are building their crafts are being rewarded for that and their things are being purchased. And if somebody seems especially worthy, my job is to make certain that I spend that money for that person who seems especially worthy. Now, I hope that they grasp the lesson, but this is something I was blind to in the past. And I believe it's the duty of the royalty, the aristocrat, the upper crust, the wealthy class. It is those of us who have much is expected of us, and one of our obligations is to set the example for those who are of a different class and to also patronize those who are of a different class.
I think that's right. And I think, by the way, I'll give a commentary on this, but I think this is extremely defensible biblically for us Christians. You know, in Matthew 26, you have the appointing of Jesus at the home of Simon the leper, wherein a woman comes to Jesus and unannounced pours a vase of very expensive ointment on him. And the disciples react and they say, why have you done this thing? This expensive ointment could have been sold and the money given to the poor. But Jesus rebukes them and says, no, she has done a beautiful thing to me. In some sense, by honoring with beauty and expense that which is highest in life, she has dignified it, she has drawn attention to it, she has made the world right and ordered in some important way. And this is a continual theme. Jesus doesn't work as hard as possible to make as much money as possible to give it to the poor. He takes these long silent retreats and contemplations. And indeed, a holy man who is held up at the end of the biblical narrative is Joseph of Arimathea, who is a wealthy man. He's described as such, and he gives his tomb, which is very magnificent, to Christ as a fitting place for his burial. So there is some sense in which the good, the true, and the beautiful should be elevated in our society, should be set apart and treated as worthy of distinction, elevation, reverence. And I think that we all benefit when that's the case. I mean, my mother's an art historian, and she spent a lifetime studying and loving and going into the greatest depths of investigation into these works of art that she could never afford. I mean, she could never buy a single one of these paintings that she is a world-leading expert on. And yet it was a family who commissioned a local artist to spend a year painting a masterpiece of their daughter or something like that. On the surface, it seems like this very self-indulgent thing, but actually it gave an artist the space to refine his craft to a level that would stand the test of time, that countless people would be able to admire. And the effects of those actions are often subtle. Like, yes, in the moment, it was an act that could be criticized as one of self-indulgence or luxury. But often those works of art have a way of finding their way into museums, finding their way into places which, again, are held up as these pillars of history and culture, and initiating generations of children, young people, into a world of aesthetic refinement and history. So these small actions can have reverberating consequences, and I think that's reflected both biblically and in our contemporary domain.
I've spent a lot of time over the last few years also thinking about the question of aristocracy. Being an American, right, a true, tried and true, pure blood American, I've never had much interest in aristocracy. But then a number of years ago, I remember what it was. I read the book by Charles Murray called Coming Apart, and I realized that I was an elite person. I had never seen myself as a member of the elite. I've always seen myself as the common man and taken great pride in that. And I took his test and I was like, wow, I am not the common man. And that kind of opened my mind to this kind of question of aristocracy. Is there a good, when there is a distinction in social class, be it formalized with the nobility or less formal, is there a good that comes from aristocrats taking their place and bearing their duty in society?
I think so. And I actually think that's what defines them as legitimate aristocrats. I mean, you have these competing classifications, and the one that is classically held in tension with the aristocracy is an oligopoly. In other words, or a plutocracy. In other words, a class of wealthy people who leverage their position in society for the propagation of their wealth, their luxury, their self-indulgence. And in fact, what defines an aristocracy is the expression in a well-ordered society of a marriage of a class who has a lot and who accept that they have a greater role to play in the stewardship of society in a way that implies sacrifice and self-restraint. So what you will see is common and by the way, when I make this argument, I am not defending every instantiation of aristocracy everywhere, nor am I defending every family which constituted the aristocracy, even at its most wonderful and refined points in history, because it has always had villains. And now, actually, I think it's at a low point in the UK, and that it's a relatively spiritually dead institution, even if facets of it live on. But properly understood, an aristocracy arises when those who have much wealth, those who do not have to work the land, who do not have an all-consuming manual task to do every day, and do have this space in their lives and the resources commensurate to that to achieve other things, devote that space and time to the cultivation of aesthetics, of manners, etiquette, faith, leadership, the preservation of the health of the people who they manage, both spiritually and physically. And really just an elevation of learning and so forth in society as a whole. And there are, contrary again to the cynic's position, many examples in many countries, both mine and yours, of different parts of the aristocracy taking up this mantle very nobly. I speak in the book about the golden age of the Boston Brahmins, who were the class of people who built Harvard. They built many of the most beautiful buildings in Massachusetts. Their sort of progenitors constituted a majority of the founding fathers of America. They included people who sacrificed almost everything they had, like John Hancock, who I mentioned in the book, risked life. He was one of the first people who would have been executed by the British if the revolution had been failed. He was one of the first out-and-out traitors against Parliament. Interestingly, if you examine the history of that period, a lot of these men were, in a sense, royalists, in that they made petitions to the King of England that it was, in fact, Parliament which was acting with tyranny in attempting to impose these taxes upon them. And they appealed to the King, who they recognized as a legitimate moral authority, almost a spiritual leader of all Englishmen everywhere, to correct this injustice which was being perpetrated on them by the conniving figures in Parliament. So I think they had a recognition of this as well, although that history has been a little bit lost, perhaps for understandable reasons. But no, there are these figures who, and the easiest way to show this is in this great, architectural patrimony which we were talking about earlier. But there are many figures, a lot of saints in the Catholic tradition, at least, have come from the upper classes. They're overrepresented amongst monks. But also, if you look at something like the First World War, the aristocracy sent their sons to die, even though they had the most to lose, at a greatly disproportionate level. They were willing to sacrifice and die for their country. Now, of course, the men who engineered that horrendous conflict were largely aristocrats as well. So the picture is more complex than that. But it is a real phenomenon that some people find themselves with an elevated position in society and embrace that role with a great nobility, which I do think justifies the title of an aristocracy.
Yeah. You bring attention to in your introductory quotes, you bring attention to two scripture passages, among others, many others, but there's one that's well known and one that's less well known. The one that's relatively well known from the New Testament, from the book of 1 Timothy, says, "Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." That one's relatively well known. The one that's less relatively well known is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, a phrase, a fragment that says, "After all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children." You have a chapter called Raising Children Worthy of Empires, and this is one of my favorite of your Substack articles. Given everything we've talked about, how do we do it? How do those of us who want to raise children that are prepared and equipped and going to be responsible, going to be the positive example of an aristocrat, the one who fulfills his duty, and we don't want to raise those who are spendthrifts and who are wasteful and morally repugnant. How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the reason that a lot of people are inclined to disinherit their children if they have great wealth is that they are searching for a way to inculcate in their children an ambition to work hard and to achieve things. And because they don't know another way to do that other than to put their children in a desperate situation in which to merely survive, they have to work hard. They're tempted to disinherit them, so to force their children into that situation. My contention in the book is that there are actually these families like the Grosvenors, and the Grosvenors are a tremendously wealthy and successful family. Hugh Grosvenor, the current Duke of Westminster, inherited £9 billion in trust. His family stretches back to 1066 when Gilbert de Grosvenor came over with the Normans to invade England and has been a central part of the aristocracy ever since, almost 1,000 years. They've built magnificent things. So it is achievable. And I point to a study in the book which traces the financial trajectories of Britain's aristocratic families. I won't get into it now, except to say that there is something special about these oldest families. They do know how to pass on a stability that seems unbelievable to those who have been raised to believe that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations is an absolute axiom. What I try to lay out in the book is a set of observations which all revolve around the theme of integrating wealthy children into a moral and practical superstructure, which shows them that metaphysically and physically, to a degree, they are not at the summit of all things. There are certain great things that they should aspire to that their money cannot easily buy for them. That's the great trap. Having this sense of purposelessness that comes with not having a vision of these great tasks that they should undertake, that are rightfully their duty to undertake. And as such, they just feel a sense of apathy, like, oh, this is the quintessential thing. You see it in media all the time, the kind of like carefree, wealthy, young, sort of dilettante, who just treats everyone around him as disposable and buys whatever he wants. If you present them with a vision of what their duties are, which are magnificent and heroic, that are difficult for them to achieve despite their station, they have places to go. Likewise, they must not believe that there are no punishments that their wealth can easily save them from. And this is another stereotype of myths and stories and so forth of the wealthy king who was never punished as a child, and who does not believe in sort of damnation, as it were. They have to believe that in the reality, in the lived reality, they have to feel very deeply of their existence in a moral supersystem with expectations, and that if they fall short of those expectations, there are real and terrifying punishments. And so you see in, I think, the history of the successful aristocratic families, a real living faith tradition, which is, the quote in the book that I give is from King Louis IX, who was the only king of France to be sainted. He built this magnificent chapel. I mean, he's responsible for a lot. He was a crusading king. He built this magnificent chapel called Sainte-Chapelle, which is often regarded as one of the great ecclesial architectural treasures of Europe. It's got these walls of stained glass. It's like it's like inhabiting a room of pure colored light. It feels very divine. But he was regarded as an excellent king. He has set in motion a lot of the things which led to France becoming an economic powerhouse and feeding its people well and so forth. He was told by his mother, Blanche of Castile, that she would rather he lay dead at her feet than that he commit a single mortal sin. And there's all kinds of wonderful stories about his life. There's a famous recollection where his wife came to him, and his wife was a bit more glamorous than him. She hadn't quite been raised in the same aesthetic tradition, and she said to him, "My king, I just wish you would dress in beautiful garments when we're in private. You do it when you're in public, but in private as well, I would love to be honored by these beautiful garments." And he said, of course, my wife, it is my duty as a husband to listen to your requests. I only ask that you listen to my request, which is that you dress as plainly as a monk yourself. she dropped the subject, as history records. But no, so that those are the kind of moral stakes, and then there's a series of ways that you can make this practical and felt. I talk about dangerous sports, and I talk about other, the way that you configure an estate to match this essentially metaphysical reality.
Yeah. I would enjoy, I want to meet you at some point soon. And one of the things that I want to discuss in that context is I want to discuss what the aristocratic institutions traditionally did. So I have a great interest in education. And I found this talk years ago. I heard John Taylor Gatto, who is a famous, insightful guy who was a school teacher, and he did a lot of research on education. And he made this reference many years ago to what all of the elite schools, the schools of the elite, have in common. Took me a decade to find it, and then I finally found it a few years ago. I found the talks on what the basic components of an aristocratic education are, or as he dubbed the education of the elites. And it's so profoundly different than what he alleged the school system provides for the commoners. But a significant portion of it, of the institutions of those days, of today even, perhaps, I don't know, I haven't gone to an elite school, but that if we look back and we look at the elite schools, they were very much structured on these things that you are talking about. And I have a dream to plunder the past of those good things and then try to make them institutionally accessible to people in the future. But my question for you, so we'll talk about that whenever I can get to meet you. My question for you is, what about people who don't have children or who don't have very many children? Is this way of thinking cut off to those persons? Because not everybody is able to have children or has children.
Well, I will concede up front that there are certain recommendations in the book that are intended for wealthy families. But I will say that those primarily revolve around specific acts of charity within one's community, taking leadership of certain institutions that requires certain material resources to meaningfully execute. For almost the rest of the book, I think it's absolutely applicable to every family. And the reason for this, I hope it would be applicable in all ages, but the reason for this is that we live in an age of extreme temptation. Our children now are tempted by sins which would have been unimaginable to previous generations. I mean, I won't go into it on your wonderful personal finance show, but we all know what a smartphone can give a child access to now, and the same is true in 1,000 ways. I mean, obviously, food gluttony has never been easier to indulge. In other words, a lot of the temptations that this structure was built to protect people from, to protect the elites from, the particular temptations of excess, are now available to every child growing up. So I do hope that for example, the discussions around rituals and the composition of the family and the moral superstructure of childhood and sports and all these different things, it's not intended to be a comprehensive child raising program. And one thing that a friend said, which I was very happy with, was that he was expecting to feel guilty if he wasn't doing all these things in the way that you sometimes do if you read a book on child raising, and you feel terrible that you're not doing all 101 recommendations every day. But it's not like that. But I do think that it's more about a disposition to the world that a family should have in inculcating your virtues in the next generation in a rigorous way in the face of great temptation. And I do think that's a universal project.
Could you tell, I was hoping you would reference the example you gave that was new to me of John Hancock's uncle and how they handled that. Could you tell a little bit of that story in this context?
Sure, yeah. Well, John Hancock, who most Americans know as the person with the very florid signature on the Declaration of Independence. I gather it's actually a colloquialism over there, a John Hancock being a reference to a signature because it's so large and magnificent. His uncle, and I'll say a little bit about John in a second, but his uncle, Thomas Hancock, was childless, but was the head. He had built up what was called the House of Hancock, which was one of the most prosperous and powerful mercantile empires in early Boston before the Revolution. And he had a very strong sense that he wanted to pass on this thing intact, that it was his life's work. He didn't want to divide it up and sell it all off to distant relatives, that he wanted a single heir. And not only that, he wanted a long time frame in which to form them to be the heir, the inheritor of his life's work that was worthy of this empire. And so when John Hancock, who was his nephew, when his father, also called John Hancock, died young, he traveled to the family and said, "I would like to take on the raising of John." And this was a convenient propositional round. Obviously, John Hancock's mother no longer had a patriarch who was providing for the family, and but nevertheless had a 7-year-old boy who had to grow up in, with a father figure present. And so he took in John and he gave him really the education and raising of a prince of the city. And this didn't just mean sending him off to college. He did, in fact, much more than that. Yes, he put John through Harvard, and I recount some amusing episodes from that in the book. But more than that, he recognized that his responsibility extended beyond outsourcing the education of John to an institution. He introduced John to every one of his personal contacts throughout the city, the business, the town hall, the inns. He made sure that John was presented aesthetically as a member befitting of his station as the heir. He announced him very publicly and proudly as the heir. This is a sort of aristocratic practice, so that there is no uncertainty about the continuation of a lineage and the passing on of authority. He got John to work very young in his company, and this is something I launch into the defense of in the book is this concept of what is now called nepotism, which I think is a greatly misunderstood concept, but essentially that genius can be born of the honing of an individual from a very young age into a particular domain. And Thomas Hancock achieved that very successfully. And he also took his charitable obligations very seriously. I mean, I go into the book mainly about the charitable works of John Hancock, his son, who's kind of a hero of a certain chapter in the book. But he learned that from Thomas. Thomas was a great man unto himself, patronizing parks, churches. He left bequests even for slaves and so forth. Like he was very careful to patronize a wide range of institutions and individuals in his area. So it is, I think, that story was not just chosen because John Hancock was a great man, and there are many lessons about how to be a great man that his life story contains, but it was a sort of defense of continuity. Like, I think that decision of Thomas to say, I'm not giving this away, I'm going to invest everything I've built in a single man who I'm going to raise to be truly excellent across multiple dimensions, proved itself, and John was completely pivotal in the revolution.
Yeah. I found that story inspiring. I didn't know anything of the history of that family prior to reading your book, and I want to dig into it more because it's part of my cultural heritage, and I love that example. And that example inspired me. I'll just share with you, and my audience knows a bit of this, but I've done this, the personal finance thing for a very long time, and I've satisfied the vast majority of my interests in the personal finance stuff. I've explored most of the things that I've interested in, and yet as I hit 1,000 episodes in 10 years, I thought, what am I still interested in? And I realized that I have virtually no interest in the vast majority of personal finance topics at this point, but there are two that I care about, and interest number one is dynasty, and interest number two is philanthropy. Because I have this deep frustration, being a longtime financial planner, I have this deep frustration with the way that philanthropy is often practiced, that it's very professionalized, and I think in some cases, does more harm than good. And I have a deep frustration in the lack of dynasty planning that occurs for most people. And I look around at the elders of my culture, and I believe that many of them need to be called to a higher duty and to a higher responsibility. And I'm pretty frustrated at this point with how many of the elders that should be working on hard problems have basically decided to say, well, we've got all the money in the world. Let's just go and buy the beach house and stroll on the beach every day and live an easy life. And I fear that if they continue to do that, we will go into a time of revolution. And I don't want to live through a revolution. I want to live in a reformation where the things that are unjust are set right, but I do not want to live through a revolution. And I believe that the elders are a component of that, and that we can raise a higher vision for the elders of our society. But one of the challenges that a lot of the elders have is they don't have much of a succession plan. They don't have many children. If they do, they did not begin with their children any kind of consistent way. I frequently find myself with, just in my work, where I do financial planning for people sometimes, and I hear two things consistently. Thing number one is often, well, we have one or two children, and, Joshua, you and your wife are fairly fecund, and if I could go back and do it over, I would have a couple more, but I only have one child or two children or something like that. And then related to that is, well, my children are kind of doing their own thing. They're not really that interested in the family business. They're not interested in what I do. And a lot of times, because of that lack of continuity, the legacy of a man is lost. And the legacy that he passes along is exclusively financial assets, completely unmoored from a sense of purpose, from a sense of focus. And I don't think I can do much for a 95-year-old. I was sending out Christmas cards this week, and I discovered that a longtime friend of mine who's extremely wealthy had passed away a few months ago. I hadn't heard, and he was 98 years old. And as far as I can tell, he left a fortune to his daughter, but it was a fortune unmoored from anything. It was just financial assets, which may she know God's wisdom and how to deal with that. But I just think, man, what if he from 60 to 90 had been engaged in another set of affairs? And I have this dream of so many of my listeners and my clients who are 55 years old and have $5 million. And they're looking down and saying, you know what, I can retire. I'm not super rich, but I can retire. And my call that I want to give is, all right, if you can do that and you believe that that's what's right for you in your family, you don't answer to me in any way, shape, or form. You answer to God. But there's a portion of those men who, if we could offer a vision of building a dynasty that will endure, and it's not going to happen with your it may not happen. It might, but it may not happen with your blood relations or your children. You may not have children. I don't think you're going to go out at 55 years old and just start having children for this purpose. But you still can be a great and mighty patriarch in our society. You still can do this. And so you still can be the Thomas Hancock who goes and finds a nephew, finds a relative, or adopts a nephew, adopts a relative, brings that person in, and takes charge of your own dynasty. You still can build this. And if you do this, you may succeed in creating somebody who is loyal to you, who after your death will take charge of your affairs in a way that will honor you, rather than you spinning in your grave because the group of professional money managers that now doles out grants to whoever comes has decided that they don't wish to honor you as a person. The only way you're going to ensure from beyond the grave that the money is handled in a way that you would approve of, based upon your values and your vision, is for you to raise up your own successors. And so when I read that story of Hancock, it gave me a new pathway to talk about, because I encounter so many men who have achieved everything that my culture can offer of wealth, financial independence, business success. And we're looking around saying, I'm 55 years old. I'm feeling pretty good. I think I could go this for another 15 or 20 years. What's that new phase of life? And my call that I want to issue is, the new phase of life is for you to embrace your duty to society, to not reject your wealth and toss aside your privilege, but to embrace it and to say, God has given me great wealth and he expects me to be faithful with it. So let me spend some years thinking about that, talking about what does it look like. And I believe that it's going to come with a significant degree of personal connection. And if we could do that, imagine we could raise up 100, 1,000, 10,000 men who take that responsibility seriously, and they've passed through the phases that you and I are in of the difficulties of just early life and the dumb mistakes that we make. And they've passed through that phase of wisdom. And imagine that those men invest a 20-year career into this kind of work. Imagine the world that our children and grandchildren will enter into when we take our responsibility to each other seriously rather than just say, nah, I'll let the money managers handle it. And so I thank you because I didn't know about Hancock, and it's that's the vision that I have, and that's what I care about going forward, because I believe that most of the problems of our society can be solved, and in order to solve them, we need to gain the wisdom of the past, the technology of the present, and bring these things together in virtuous relationships, so that we can build the society of the future. So, any comments on that, Johann?
Well, no, I think you're right. Of course, I think you're absolutely right, and I think you stated it with great gravity. I mean, this is all interrelated. Let me perhaps give you an example. I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and he's advising a very wealthy family in the area that I'm now in, and they have a problem, which is a common problem now, which is that the patriarch, it's time for him to retire. He is very old. And none of his children have an interest in taking over this business, and this business is very valuable. Now, that's a problem unto itself, and we've spoken about family businesses and their place in continuity, their role in passing on not just wealth but duty to children, their ballast in society. You know, the fact that these family businesses, for example, the literature shows that they tend to be more prosperous over time. They also tend to be better valued by their employees as generous and caring employers and so forth. So there's a range of advantages. Part of the problem, and I won't go into this because we've spoken about it a little bit, is in preparing the children from a very young age to associate their identity, their direction, their journey in life with the trajectory of the family business. And most people haven't done this. However, a lot of it is also to do with the failure to cultivate charity. And what I mean by that is often these businesses are conventional, not particularly glamorous businesses in conventional, not particularly glamorous towns. Now, they're very important to the fabric of those towns. They're prosperous businesses, but they're not in, Hollywood or whatever. And what the children sense is that these towns it would be a very different world if over the course of the last 20 years, the patriarch had built a truly beautiful house that the children could not buy or build for themselves anywhere else. It is not just another house. It's not a McMansion. It's not just another large house. It is a beautiful, carefully constructed legacy object, which is filled with legacy objects, with fine things which have been collected, heirlooms passed down, and so forth. In other words, a sense of place has been built, a flag has been put in the sand that is of great value and that it is difficult to abandon. And now imagine that around that, an incredibly local, invested, personal campaign of charity had been conducted over 2 generations, such that the townsfolk, the people that you lived in community, in covenant with, were remarkably healthy, vibrant, culturally sophisticated, nourished, fecund, having children. That this was an actual living, breathing town, where so many towns really struggle in that domain, that it was aesthetically beautiful. I mean, people move in the UK to completely impractical villages just because they're picturesque, and they will make incredible sacrifices to that regard because they're well maintained, because the older properties have been protected, renovated, listed, and so forth. So there's an entire network of related factors that elevate the status objectively of a place in a line of work in a lot of subtle ways that makes even fairly unglamorous multi-generational businesses just absolutely morally necessary. And children yearn to take over them because they're at this integral place in a rich tapestry of story and culture and place and history and identity and so forth. And that fabric, I think, is really neglected today. It just becomes one financial asset amongst many, and it's just more convenient for the children if it's sold, and they can do whatever they want. And so I do think that underlying structure has to be reified.
Yeah. Absolutely. Johann, I hope that this is the first of a long and enjoyable relationship. So I want to promote some of your things. First of all, you have the recent book, Leaving a Legacy, Inheritance, Charity, and 1,000-Year Families, available at least on Amazon and possibly wherever books are sold. I believe that you've recently left your paid employment to do this independent work full-time. Is that right?
To the great confusion and distress of my wider family, yes,
Okay.
indeed, I have.
So I would like to ask all of my audience, please go and purchase Johann's book, Leaving a Legacy. I've been a subscriber of his on his Substack for, I think, at least about a year or so, and I have enjoyed his articles, and he's poured a lot of the framework of his articles into this book. So please go and purchase Leaving a Legacy by Johann Kurtz. Go and subscribe to his Substack, which is becomingnoble.substack.com, becomingnoble.substack.com. Support him on a monthly basis so that he has more certainty with his cash flow so he can continue doing this work. And then you have a website at johannkurtz.com, johannkurtz.com. Is that right?
You won't find anything there. That's just a
Okay.
placeholder for my email address.
For the future,
but,
okay. Is there anything else that I can promote of yours?
No, that was incredibly generous already.
Okay.
Thank you. No, the book is my baby right now. So.
Good, yeah. So go and purchase Leaving a Legacy, and purchase some extra copies for those who you know and who you love. Because what I will tell you is that in the world of financial planning, there is a great deal of material and information on the technicality, but there is very little that gives a bit of a vision. And this is a worthy book that really helps to give that vision. And anybody who is not broke will appreciate this. And even those who might be broke will appreciate it to stretch out that vision. So Johann, thank you for what you're doing. I want to promote you. I want you to keep doing this work. You're an insightful thinker. You are a careful analyst, and you are an insightful observer of our current moment. And I believe that by promoting work like this, where individuals can focus on what they're doing, we can make tremendous progress. So thank you for being here at Radical Personal Finance. All right. I actually just lost, I was running out of disk space on my computer. I lost the last 20 seconds of my thing, but we got the rest of it. So thank you.
Great.
very